Good afternoon. Today I shall give you a brief review of Shakespearean comedy in general and the circumstances in which Shakespeare wrote his comedies. For Shakespeare's comedies, it is a general rule that beyond laughter and jesting, for both performers and audiences in the theatre, comedy exists as a narrative form or structure. This form is based on the expectation that the delightful temporary disorder of the tale or story of the play will be resolved with incorporation into normal society, or at least a gesture towards that. A gesture that can be on occasion deeply ironical. Comedies as a genre end with weddings and feasts rather than deaths and funerals. This is common knowledge to us, though the latter can often be sensed not too far away. Models of comic structure were provided in the pre Shakespearean English theatre via a number of routes, the most predominant being the route of the Roman comedy. The plays of Terence and Plautus were used in schools in Elizabethan times to teach Latin, even though their plots usually displayed the immoral, as it were, triumph of the young lovers, aided by clever servants over foolish father figures. Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, for example, is an adaptation of Plautus's Manage Me. He outdoes his master by adding, among other plot elements, another pair of twins to the antiphony, their comic servants, the Dromios. Other character types that occur in Roman comedy and are picked up by Shakespeare in various plays include the boastful soldier, the doctor, either as a con man or a foolish old man, and sometimes the sheepish wife. These comic types were developed also in 16th century Italian comedy, both what was called the commedia erudita, literally comedies played in aristocratic courts and academies and widely published, and commedia dell'arte, the work of traveling playing companies that searched for desperately and used literary plays for materials for their improvised, more often than not, three-act scenarios or occasionally five-act scripted plays. In the mid 1580s, the English writers, mostly John Lilly and George Peele, wrote and published highly literary plays that were performed at court and read by fashionable ladies. It is perhaps with Lilly that the exploration of love in comedy and its effects on lovers begin. We find the musings of lovers on their own feelings, the mockery of their folly by others, the careful plotting of the game of love, etc. Lilly also anticipates Shakespeare in providing witty minor characters in his comedies who indulge in extended repartee and wordplay. Now, Shakespeare's major comedies were written at a peculiarly fertile time in English intellectual and cultural history, the 1590s. At the time, the professional public theatre was flourishing. Let us keep in mind that purpose built theatres had only appeared in London as late as the 1570s. At that point in time, London was a rich melting pot, as it were, of people of all classes. Printed books and materials were becoming cheap and popular and easily accessible. Artistic and philosophical discussions were fashionable, but so were gossip, travelers' tales, and stories of teeming underlife of the city. Mongrel theatre, as Sir Philip Sidney famously called it once, or hybrid forms would seem to suit the very temper of the times. In general, there was already a strong tradition of miscellaneity or a hybrid or mixed theatre in earlier English drama, well before Shakespeare. We have examples of plays that were successfully given at court. For example, Thomas Preston's King Cambyses, which was staged perhaps as early as 1558, for example, has a title page which describes it as quote unquote a lamentable tragedy mixed full of pleasant mirth. So Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream, commenting on the very tragical mirth offered by Pyramus and Thisbe, should well be used to the mixed genre, and although he feels it amusingly naive, unlike Aegeus or Sidney, he appreciates the work of imagination and of simpleness and duty, the humility of the actors in making their offering. Now let us keep in mind that there were objections to the theatre which were both moral and intellectual. On the moral front, we remember Stephen Gosson, who essentially was an anti-theatricalist, and he wrote in Plays Confuted in 1582 that, and I quote, bawdy comedies in Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish have been thoroughly ransacked to furnish the playhouses in London. Unquote. He was simply recording a fact that professional English theatre of those times was in its heyday, and writers and owners of the theatres were energetically availing themselves of anything that could be adapted and would sell to an audience. As well as a long tradition of moralizing against the theatre, here represented by Stephen Gosson, for example, there was also aesthetic criticism, the famous of which is Sir Philip Sidney's complaint in his Apology for Poetry, where Philip Sidney says, and I quote, all their plays be neither right tragedies nor right comedies, mingling kings and clowns, not because the matter so carrieth it, but thrust in clowns by head and shoulders to play a part in majestical matters, with neither decency nor discretion, so as neither the admiration and commiseration nor the right sportfulness is by the mongrel tragicomedy obtained. So this is Sir Philip Sidney at his harshest possible against the theatre of his times. Now Sidney evidently was an aristocrat and a poet. His perspective on the contemporary theatre of his times uh, came significantly from his classical education, and he wrote well before Shakespeare began his career. At the center of his argument is the theory of decorum or fitness, which is to be found significantly in all the major theoretical treatises of the 16th century. As Viola remarks, famously again, after her conversation with Feste about the job of being a jester, and the words are, and I quote, he must observe their mood on whom he jests, the quality of persons and the time. This occurs in Act 3 of the play. As for a witty man, so for a play goes the classical theory. But the popular and successful plays of the 16th century got their laughs and their popular successes by being essentially indecorous, by combining kings and clowns, as it were, just as Shakespeare went on to do, combining miracles and rough magic, grotesque bodies and graceful heroics. Imogen's lament in Cymbeline over the decapitated body of Cloten, which he thinks to be that of a husband, is an extreme example of this teasing and disruption of the audience's responses by refusing to obey and deliberately refusing to obey the rules of decorum. Actresses performing this scene never know whether they will get laughter or sympathetic suspenseful silence from the audience who are listening or who are watching the plays. The scene was anticipated perhaps 10 years earlier in Thisbe's lament over Pyramus in the Mechanical Daydream, with verbal cues suggesting a comic response from the audience. But even here, a determined flute of Thisbe can silence laughter by the intensity of a performance. The same effects can be found in the English vernacular tradition of drama that Shakespeare knew and experienced firsthand, possibly as an audience in his early days, the mystery plays, which dated from the 15th century when England was still a Catholic country and the church engaged the imagination of the people through the annual amateur drama festivals that told and retold again the narratives of the Christian faith. In the morality plays of the 15th and early 16th centuries, in which we find allegorical figures such as everyman undergoing moral and religious adventures, the figure of vice became prominent. Now, the vice, by the way, the vice is known by various names in mystery and morality plays, represents essentially the attractive face of wrongdoing. He is cleverer than anyone else on the stage, and he attempts to show his cleverness predominantly through dialogue. He chats to the audience directly about how he is going to fool everyone on the stage with his tricks and words, thus essentially making the audience complicit with his ideas. He almost gets found out, he is detected, so that the audience has learned a lesson. However clever or superior they think they are, ultimately, goodness and righteousness is made to win. Shakespeare models his blackly comic play Richard III on the vice and develops it further in much later plays. We have, for example, Iago in Othello, Iachimo in Cymbeline, etc. But arguably, the vice's habit of witty chat to the audience, his liking for turning up unexpectedly on the stage and taking advantage of the situation, significantly influenced the development of Shakespeare's clowns. Now, with regard to the contribution of clowns in the making of Shakespearean comedy, it is perhaps important to distinguish between the several types of clowns, as it were, on the Elizabethan stage. The servant clown, for example, like Dromios in the Comedy of Errors, is a figure derived directly from Roman comedy and its 16th century Italian descendants, notably in the Commedia dell'arte. This type of clown indulges in witty exchanges with his master and with others on the stage, but is also subject to constant physical abuse of some form or the other, though the genre of farce can make this seem merely comical. On the other hand, we have the country clown, as it were, which is a creation of the English native tradition. We have no evidence of country clowns, as it were, in the ancient Italian comedies, who happen to be a sweet natured, unsophisticated figure whose view of the world is entirely restricted to his local activities. These country clowns can be witty, but it is more often an accident than a deliberately professional attempt to hold the intellectual high ground. We have this example in Costard in Love's Labour Lost. Well, he's an excellent example of this type, and he is still to be found in the delightful young shepherd of the Winter's Tale, conned out of his money by the vice of rogue Autolycus. A variant of the country clown is the non-rural worker, if I may call it, He may be a community constable like Dogberry, Dull Elbow. He may be a castle porter as in Macbeth. He may be a pimp as in Pompey in Measure for Measure, or a grave digger as in Hamlet. Though these roles may simply be classified as comic, they function, as do the country clowns, as satirical commentators on the doings of the higher folk. And by higher folk, I mean folks who are stationed higher in their lives compared to the clown. It is essentially this commentary role, whether conscious or unintentional, that is at the heart of the clown's function in much of Shakespeare's comedies. Essentially, it acts as a bridge between the stage and the audience. The fool, the most consciously witty of Shakespeare's clown roles, always played by a specialist actor in Shakespeare's company, is a professional jester who makes his living by begging tips for his jokes and songs. He is usually attached to a noble household, though he may not actually live there. His role is usually to deflate through wit, at times obscure wit, but deliberately so, the more pretentious attitudes of those in power or those occupying a higher station in life. In Twelfth Night, Feste draws our attention to this role in his conversation with Viola, as in As You Like It. Touchstone's moralizing job is greatly envied by Jacques, himself a somewhat sardonic outsider. In All's Well That Ends Well, we have Lavache foregrounding his relation to the audience by satirizing the fawning behavior of the courtiers in his virtuoso. He says, I have an answer that will serve all men, O Lord, sir. All stand aslant to the society on which they depend. The French word for actor, interestingly, is comédien. It began to be used about the middle of the 16th century, if not earlier, indicating a general sense of a new form of entertainment or a new type of occupation. That is professional acting in short. Olivia, for example, asks Viola, who is disguised as Cesario, at their first meeting. She asks, are you a comedian? Viola replies unequivocally, no, my profound heart, and yet, by the very fangs of malice, I swear, I am not that I play. This occurs in the first act of Twelfth Night. This exchange, for example, sets up one of the most persistent themes in most of Shakespeare's comedies, as well as the comedies of Shakespeare's contemporaries. Its meta-theatrical consciousness. Like a number of his contemporary playwrights, Shakespeare also does not want the audience to lose themselves in the story to the extent that they forget that they are in the theatre. This awareness, these plays, that is, this comedy suggest, actually adds to their pleasure. The audience, trained and sophisticated by decades of public theatre, becomes essentially a privileged assistant to the actor's job of storytelling. Actors were nevertheless at this time legally vagabonds, if I may use that word, for the want of any other accurate word. Vagabonds having virtually no rights in the social structure. The safest way around this situation was to become a member of a company of players attached either to a nobleman or to a member of the court. For example, Shakespeare's company began as the Lord Chamberlain's men and mutated triumphantly into the King's men when James I ascended the throne. This position gave them some form of a modicum of protection from prosecution, but it also put them in the position of having to keep their patron on their side. So essentially, it's an unenviable role that these actors were placed in. The role of the clown, thus, has a particular resonance in all of this setup because he is an allowed fool, as we find this in Twelfth Night, and an accomplished verbal quibbler. He is the locus of any satirical protest that the successful commercial company, that is theatre company, operating in its own theatre well away from both the court and puritanical city, might want to express against their feudal situation. So these are the few words which I had to tell you before we go specifically into Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which we shall be doing in a subsequent talk. Thank you.